As is known, the history of any state is primarily based on written documents. The oldest among them are chronicles, which are annual-based accounts of events. Chronicles are also called annals or codices. Unfortunately, all the major Russian chronicles that have survived to this day are not original sources. They are scribal copies, which means they are texts copied from some more ancient manuscripts that have not been preserved. Therefore, historians refer to them as both chronicles and scribal copies when discussing a particular chronicle. Among the Russian chronicles, the main ones are considered to be the Laurentian Codex, the Hypatian Codex, the Novgorod Chronicle, and the Chronicles of Pereyaslavl of Suzdal Monastery. However, historians consider the Radziwiłł Chronicle to be the oldest Russian chronicle that has survived to this day. It is this chronicle that forms the basis of the traditional version of ancient Russian history. It is believed that the Radziwiłł Chronicle appeared in the 15th century. This unique monument of Russian literature contains over 600 colorful miniatures. Based on the study of these drawings, scholars have concluded that the Radziwiłł Chronicle is a copy of some earlier chronicle, most likely the Smolensk one, the original of which has not been preserved. The foundation of the Radziwiłł Chronicle is the so-called Nestor's Chronicle, also known as the Tale of Bygone Years. It tells about historical events from biblical times to the beginning of the 12th century. Despite historians dating the Radziwiłł Chronicle to the 15th century, its history can only be traced back to the 18th century. Upon careful examination, it becomes evident that not only its age but also its significance for Russian history has been exaggerated. It is believed that the first mention of the Radziwiłł Chronicle is associated with the name of Stanislaw Zinovich, who presented it to the Vilnius governor Janusz Radziwiłł. Janusz's son, Boguslaw Radziwiłł, allegedly transferred it to the Königsberg Library in 1671. This is how the chronicle acquired its second name, the Königsberg Chronicle. In 1715, Peter the Great passed through Königsberg, where he saw the chronicle and requested a copy for himself. In the same year, a copy was made and sent to Peter. This copy was studied by Tatishchev and later by Lomonosov. In 1758, during the 7 Years' War between Russia and Prussia, Königsberg was occupied by Russian troops, who discovered the original chronicle. In 1761, it was brought to St. Petersburg, to the library of the Russian Academy of Sciences, where the chronicle is kept to this day. Once in the library, the chronicle fell into the hands of August Schlotzer, who believed that all written documents, especially chronicles, needed to undergo preliminary critical processing for the writing of Russian history. This meant keeping some parts, correcting others, and even discarding some. Schlotzer began preparing an edition of the Radziwiłł Chronicle, but not for Russian readers, rather for German readers. Surprisingly, the Radziwiłł Chronicle was first published in Germany in the German language. According to historical documents, there were supposed preparations for a Russian edition of the Chronicle, but for some reason, it never materialized. And all the prepared materials that Lomonosov had been working on perished in a fire in 1812. In general, the history of the publication of the Radziwiłł Chronicle looks very strange. A worthy edition of the oldest and, as historians say, the most unique Russian chronicle, only appeared at the end of the 20th century. Prior to that, the chronicle was published in 1767, not from the original, but from a copy made for Peter the Great back in 1715. However, compared to the original, the copy contained many inaccuracies and discrepancies. Moreover, when preparing the publication of the Radziwiłł Chronicle, even more errors were introduced into the text than when making the copy. Therefore, this edition could not be considered scholarly. The next publication took place only in 1902. The main manuscript was published using photomechanical methods, but without transcriptions. It was only in 1989 that the Radziwiłł Chronicle was published as a full-fledged scholarly edition as part of the complete collection of Russian chronicles. In 1995, a beautiful facsimile copy of the chronicle was released. It was an important scholarly event. Interestingly, under the pretext of publication, the Radziwiłł Chronicle ended up in private hands several times. This history is quite obscure. It is unclear why, but it transitioned from the library of the Academy of Sciences to the personal possession of secret advisor Muravyov. After his death, it ended up with the renowned archaeographer and director of the Imperial Public Library, Olenin. When Alexander Ivanovich Yermolayev, who served as a manuscript curator in the same library, prepared the chronicle for publication, the Academy of Sciences demanded that Olenin return the Radziwiłł Chronicle. However, Olenin categorically refused to do so. The reason for his refusal is intriguing. He stated that another edition of the chronicle needed to be prepared. It should be in color, not black and white, and therefore more expensive. He demanded 3,000 rubles from the Academy of Sciences for the publication of the manuscript with color illustrations. Olenin received the money from the Academy but never published the chronicle. The true reason why the publication of the chronicle never took place is unknown. When the new president of the Academy of Sciences, Count Uvarov, inquired about it in 1818, the academicians responded that the Academy was not at fault, and the delay in the publication was due to Mr. Olenin's numerous engagements. In other words, the director of the Imperial Library was very occupied and had no time for explanations. However, for some reason, they were completely unconcerned that such a unique document remained in private hands for so long, without any supervision.
The Library of the Academy of Sciences was created primarily for the needs of academic scholars. For example, the acquisition of our collections was largely oriented towards the needs of academic science. Therefore, it is not surprising that materials required for the work of a particular historian, in this case, were issued to them for home use. This was a normal practice in the 18th and 19th centuries.
In the end, the Radziwiłł Chronicle did return to the library of the Academy of Sciences. But what was done with it while it changed hands can only be speculated upon today. However, we will try to figure it out. After the publication of the academic description of the chronicle and the release of the facsimile, a wide circle of researchers and historians could finally become acquainted with the Radziwiłł Chronicle. Among them were Russian scholars Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, the authors of the new chronology. They thoroughly studied the description first, and then the facsimile images of the pages, and came to an unexpected conclusion. The Radziwiłł Chronicle is not a written artifact of the 15th century.
No one before us analyzed the pages of the Chronicle so attentively and meticulously. All the researchers who have worked with this text until now believed that they were dealing with an authentic ancient text. Unfortunately, they were mistaken. They overlooked clear signs of forgery, which became visible only from the perspective of the new chronology.
We cannot understand why the historians themselves, who compiled this description, did not pay attention to the obvious signs of forgery and tampering in the Radziwiłł Chronicle. Our only explanation is that they probably noticed it but either did not have the strength or were afraid to speak out about it.
Until 1995, the Radziwiłł Chronicle was kept in this binding. When the decision was made to release a facsimile edition of the Chronicle, it was unbound. After the release of the facsimile, the Chronicle was restored, and the lost paper fragments were reconstructed. After the restoration, the size of the book block increased, and the old cover turned out to be too small. For several years, specialists debated whether to return the Chronicle to its old binding or create a new one. In the end, in 2002, a new binding was made, and the old covers are now stored separately from the Chronicle. Unfortunately, the new binding obscured some details of the Chronicle, which are referenced in the research of Fomenko and Nosovsky. However, these details are present in the academic description of the Chronicle, which we will also use. Therefore, this unique manuscript consists of 32 signatures. Initially, each signature had 4 folded pieces of paper, resulting in 8 leaves in each signature. However, what is unclear is that the number of leaves in each signature is even, but the total number of leaves in the manuscript is odd, specifically 251 leaves. Does this mean that one of the leaves was lost or, conversely, added later? Upon careful examination of the Chronicle, it is clearly visible that the first and last leaves are in place. This means that the missing leaf was located inside the Chronicle. Consequently, one of the leaves lacks a pair, and there should be a meaningful gap in the text. Let's try to figure out where in the manuscript this mysterious place with the unpaired leaf is located. Let's turn to the academic description of the Chronicle. It states that signatures 3 to 28 contain 8 leaves each. All the double leaves in them are intact and not torn. This means that these signatures do not raise any suspicions. However, when it comes to the first and second signatures, the picture is completely different. Firstly, the first signature consists of 6 leaves, meaning it is reduced by 2 leaves. But after it, almost until the end of the manuscript, standard 8-leaf signatures follow. So, where did the 2 leaves from the first signature go? Secondly, all the double leaves in the first 2 signatures were torn in half, pages were separated and did not go into the fold of the signature. Most likely, somewhere here is where the unpaired leaf is located. This can be verified as follows. In the Radziwiłł Chronicle, leaves are numbered in two ways, with Church Slavonic letters and Arabic numerals. The letter al corresponds to the numeral 1, ve corresponds to 2, ga corresponds to 3, and so on. The numbering with Slavonic letters is placed in the lower right corner of the page, while the numbering with numerals is placed in the upper right corner. In the past, not only leaves but signatures were also numbered. The first page of each signature was assigned its number. The numbers of the signatures are indicated only with letters. Unfortunately, during the binding of the manuscript, a large part of these markings was cut off. The first preserved signature number, which corresponds to Church Slavonic letter, y, is on the 33rd leaf. The second preserved signature number, 9, is on the 65th leaf, and so on. Therefore, in all signatures, including the first one, there were originally 8 leaves because the last leaf of each signature, 32, 64, was a multiple of 8. Now let's take a close look at the pages of the first 2 signatures. On the first 7 leaves, the numbering is either absent or done in different styles. It is evident that the numbers were written at different times and by different people. The entire text of this part of the chronicle is composed of separate, loosely connected fragments. Logical discontinuities, repetitions, and different terminology indicate edits made at some point. And it is precisely on these pages that the earliest history of Russia is described. The origin of Slavic tribes, the founding of Novgorod and Kiev. Now let's examine the condition of the script of Arabic numerals and Church Slavonic letters. Here are 3 leaves: the 10th, 11th, and 12th. It is quite obvious that the numbers were corrected and increased by 1. The 10th number was made from the 9th. For this, the letter Fida was replaced with the letter E. Correcting the Church Slavonic number 10 to 11 was not a big challenge at all. They simply added the letter al next to the letter E. The alteration is particularly clear on the 12th leaf. In Church Slavonic, 12 is written as V. But it can be seen that initially, it was written as AE, meaning 11. The 2 strokes added to the letter al made it resemble ve. This alteration is so crude that it is impossible not to notice it. But there was a genuine, unaltered 12th leaf in the chronicle. Where is it? Most likely, it was simply torn out. This is where the text has a logical gap. The 13th leaf starts a new sentence. This is clearly visible. There is a large red cinnabar letter at the beginning of the sentence, and the previous sentence, supposedly on the 12th leaf, is incomplete. The period at the end of this sentence does not signify its completion. In the past, a period was written as a triangle made up of 3 dots, and a single dot represented a comma. All these manipulations with the leaves were done to make room for the leaf with Church Slavonic number 9. It is from this point in the chronicle that the numerical and alphabetical page numbering diverges. This is the leaf with Arabic number 8 and Slavonic number 9. Even a quick glance is enough to see it. The leaf was not part of a whole spread. Its corners are torn and worn. So why was space freed up for this leaf? What is written on it? It is precisely on this leaf with Arabic number 8 and Church Slavonic number 9 that the famous story of the calling of the Varangians to Russia is told. This story forms the basis of the renowned Norman theory proposed by Baer, Müller, and Schlotzer regarding the origin of the Russian state. According to this theory, Kievan Russia was established by Scandinavians, Swedish Vikings. They allegedly subjugated the East Slavic tribes and became the ruling class among them. The Norman legend states that supposedly in the year 6370, from Adam, the Slavic tribes refused to pay tribute to the Varangians and set out to govern themselves.
There was no law among them, but tribe rose against tribe, and they began to war one against another. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." They accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Russes. The Teudes, the Slavs, the Krivichians then said to the people of Rus, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." They thus selected 3 brothers, with their kinsfolk, who took with them all the Russes and came to the Slovenes. The oldest, Rurik, built the city of Ladoga and located himself in Ladoga, the second, Cineas, at Belo Ozero, and the third, Truva, in Izborsk. On account of those Varangians, the land became known as the Russian land.
But if we could remove this page, how would the narrative of the chronicle change? After all, it is only on this inserted leaf that the city of Ladoga and Lake Ladoga are mentioned as landmarks of the location of Rurik's first capital, somewhere amidst the swamps of the Pskov region. Since we cannot remove the leaf, let's simply ignore it. And then Rurik becomes just a Russian prince, specifically from Rostov, rather than Scandinavian. Russian chronicles contain many stories about the calling of princes to rule in one city or another. At that time, it was a common practice in Russia. Moreover, if the citizens called someone to rule as prince, it did not mean that they fully surrendered themselves to the new rulers. Princes were merely hired for service, and if the residents of a city were dissatisfied with a prince's performance, they would simply expel him and replace him with another. Many examples of such cases can be found, for instance, in the illustrated chronicle of Ivan the Terrible. They all indicate that the rulers of cities were chosen from their own princes, not foreigners. Therefore, the calling of strangers, supposedly Scandinavian princes, is a unique case in Russian history. Even Nikolai Karamzin, who never disputed the Norman theory, wrote with bewilderment in his History of the Russian State, "The beginning of Russian history presents us with an amazing and perhaps unparalleled case in chronicles. The Slavs voluntarily destroy their ancient rule and demand sovereigns from the Varangians, who were their enemies. Everywhere, the sword of the mighty or the cunning of the ambitious introduced autocracy. In Russia, it was established with the general consent of the citizens. Indeed, this is a remarkable case because Russians have had a special, sacred relationship with their homeland from time immemorial. Practically all surviving ancient documents speak of the highest and most sacred duty in Russia being the defense of one's homeland. Russians surrender themselves to the rule of an enemy who did not even attack them, only on this page of the tale of bygone years. Moreover, according to the Norman theory, Slavs received not only statehood from foreign princes, but even their own name, Rus. The absurdity of this claim was already demonstrated in the 19th century by the Russian scholar and historian Yegor Ivanovich Klassen, who accused the authors of the Norman theory, Baer, Müller, and Schlotzer, of treating Russian history dishonestly. He wrote, "They adopted everything characteristic Russian to their own people, and even attempted to take away not only the glory, greatness, power, wealth, industry, trade, and all the good qualities of their hearts, but even the people's name of the Slavic Rus people. The name Rus, known from ancient times as Slavic, not only to all Asian peoples but also to the Israelites since their arrival in the Promised Land. And yet, based on one pasted, shabby leaf of paper, the theory that Russians were incapable of statehood has persisted for 300 years. Relying on this theory, not only Western but also domestic Russian scholars, Karamzin, Kluchevsky, Solovyov, year after year, century after century, instilled in the Russian people an inferiority complex, accustomed them to the idea of a secondary place in world history. For several centuries, the Norman theory was considered the only correct one. And the main argument for its infallibility was just a few lines from the tale of bygone years. But the forgeries in the Radziwiłł Chronicle do not end there. By inserting one leaf into the chronicle, the forgers prepared a place for another forged leaf. On the Norman page of the Radziwiłł Chronicle, there is an interesting note. Not the 8th leaf, but the 9th should be counted, because there is a missing leaf before this. That is, supposedly, there was another leaf before the Norman leaf. If the leaf is lost, then there should be a gap in the text. Let's see. The 7th leaf in the chronicle is well preserved, but the top of the next leaf is damaged, and some fragments of the text are lost. However, it was possible to reconstruct it from other chronicles that included the tale of bygone years. So, here is how this text sounds.
Then the Khazars came upon them as they lived in the hills and forests, and demanded tribute from them. After consulting among themselves, the Polyanians paid as tribute 1 sword per hearth. The Bulgarians, upon seeing that they could offer no resistance, asked to be baptized and to submit themselves to the Greeks. The Tsar baptized their prince with all his boyars, and made peace with the Bulgarians.
Where is the semantic gap here? Moreover, the previous page ends with a period, and this page begins with a capital red letter. It is quite obvious that there are no omissions or breaks in this text. It is a complete, coherent thought. But nonetheless, someone's accommodating hand wrote that a leaf was missing exactly here. And, certainly, it was found, and by none other than Schlotzer. Since then, the contents of this newly found leaf have been included in all editions of the Tale of Bygone Years, except for photocopies, because the original chronicle does not contain this leaf. Strangely enough, the miraculously discovered by Schlotzer leaf was not returned to its supposedly rightful place. What was written on this supposedly found leaf? It turns out that it was nothing less than a chronology of ancient Russian history and its connection to world chronology. The entire chronology of Kievan Rus is presented, with references to Byzantine and Roman chronology. Without this page, Russian chronology hangs in the air and loses its connection to world Scaligerian history. But where is this leaf itself? Why wasn't it included in the chronicle, just like the Norman one? Whoever wrote this supposedly lost leaf understood perfectly well how important it is for constructing the chronology of Russian history. That's why they treated this leaf more seriously than the Norman one. The Norman leaf was simply crudely glued in, hoping for the Romanovs to figure out where their Rurik came from. That's their local history. But chronology is a completely different matter because the falsified Russian chronology was part of a global falsification of history. Schlotzer and his colleagues were well aware of this. In the 18th century, they still remembered the price at which the fake Scaligerian history and chronology were introduced. That's why they didn't rush to paste in the chronological leaf. The forgery would have been too obvious. A new edition of the chronicle was needed. A new scribal copy in which this leaf seemed to have been there from the beginning. With the help of a cunning note in the margins saying, "Here a leaf is lost," they only prepared a placeholder for it. Perhaps it was for this purpose that a copy of the Radziwiłł Chronicle was made. The so-called Moscow Academic Chronicle or the Trinity Sergius copy, in which this lost leaf was already present, and no one noticed the insert. However, it is possible that the falsifiers did not limit themselves to forging only a few pages. It is quite possible that the entire Radziwiłł Chronicle was written not in the 15th century but in the 18th century. Historians say that the watermark on the paper indicates the time of the chronicle's creation. It is clearly visible that the watermark is in the shape of a bull's head. It is believed that such watermarks were only made in the 15th century. However, unfortunately, dating a manuscript based on watermarks is not absolute. The compilers of the chronicle could have used paper supplies made 2 centuries ago. As is known, paper can be stored for more than a century under good conditions. Specialists refer to this as the storing or aging of paper.
I have encountered cases of paper aging for up to 40 years. According to colleagues, they encountered much longer periods that can be measured in centuries. But I'm not even talking about cases of falsification, when, for example, old paper is used to write manuscripts 200 to 300 years later. Such cases also happen.
Moreover, the watermark itself could have been used by a paper mill in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Furthermore, several pages from the binding and the old binding itself are dated precisely to the 18th century, also based on watermarks. Interestingly, all editions of the Tale of Bygone Years known today are also written on paper with the watermark of a bull's head or its variations. Miniatures also speak to the fact that the dating of the Radziwiłł Chronicle should not be tied to the paper. In 1958, an important step was taken in the study of the Radziwiłł Chronicle. Art historian Olga Ilyinichna Podobedova examined and photographed the illustrations under ultraviolet and infrared rays. It turned out that all the multi-figure compositions consisted of at least 3 layers of revisions made by different artists at different times. Moreover, each artist changed the positions of the figures, redrew faces, added new weapons, princely hats, crowns, and changed clothing. But that's not all. Podobedova concluded that the second artist worked on the drawings shortly after the first, while the third artist worked on them a considerable time later. Thus, art historian Podobedova made a very important discovery. The work on the illustrations continued much longer than was previously thought. The Tale of Bygone Years is the main text of the Hypatian Chronicle, the Laurentian Chronicle, and the Troitsko-Sergievsky Chronicle. Interestingly, they were discovered in different, quite distant locations from each other. In Königsberg, Suzdal, and the Moscow Governorate. According to historians, these chronicles were written at different times and by completely different people. However, the main text of the chronicle, that is, the text of the Tale of Bygone Years, is almost identical. It only differs in minor stylistic edits. Historians do not find this surprising since all these manuscripts are based on the same Nestor's copy. But if the Laurentian, Hypatian, and Troitsko-Sergievsky chronicles are copies of the same ancient original, then it is unclear how this original spread over such a great distance from Königsberg to the Vladimir Governorate. It was not an easy task to accomplish at that time. And why was so little of the original text modified? After all, the scribes worked independently of each other. Most likely, all these copies, the Laurentian, Hypatian, and Troitsko-Sergievsky, were made using a copy of the Radziwiłł Chronicle, published in 1767, and created in the same place. And only later were they supposedly accidentally discovered by diligent antiquarians like Musin, Pushkin, and Karamzin. In order to have more evidence for the falsified version of ancient Russian history, it needed to be widely replicated. It is likely that additional chronicles were created for this purpose. This version is indirectly supported by the following fact. There is not a word about the Norman origin of the summoned princes in such a monumental artifact of ancient Russian book art as the illustrated chronicle of Ivan the Terrible. And yet, in terms of large scale and breadth of coverage of historical events, this document has no analogues in the world.
The Illustrated Chronicle is a document from the 16th century that fully and extensively presents the concept of Russian statehood and its direct connection with Orthodoxy. It is possible that in this document, the Illustrated Chronicle, the authors reflected the concept of Russia's historical destiny from ancient times to the time of Ivan Vasilievich. The emphasis on the country's history and the vision of educated Russian scribes of the 16th century are set forth here. There is no place for the Norman theory.
And indeed, in the text of this multi-volume chronograph, consisting of 10 volumes, there is only one mention of the calling of Rurik and his brothers. Not a word is said about their foreign origin.
For we are descended from those great princes, from our first great prince Rurik, whom our land willingly took from the Varangians as its ruler with his 2 brothers. Then his great-grandson, the Grand Prince Vladimir, was baptized, and he baptized all our lands.
It is not stated from which locality the princes came, but it is said that they were from the Varangians. Supporters of the Norman theory still associate the term Varangians with Scandinavian Vikings. Although many chronicles, Russian, Greek, and Western European, speak of the Varangians as not being a people but a special military caste. As Yegor Ivanovich Clausen wrote, they were hired as auxiliary troops and served the same purpose in trade routes, protecting merchant vessels from attacks, in the seas from sea robbers, and on rivers from river robbers. Among the Varangians were people of different nationalities, including Russians. After examining the Radziwiłł Chronicle, the impression of something counterfeit and unreal is left not only by the pasted and mixed-up pages but also by the artistic design of the chronicle. Many drawings are unfinished or very roughly done. It gives the impression that the artists were trying to depict a style that they were not familiar with, and they were working in great haste. This is indicated by the incompleteness of the Radziwiłł Chronicle. It lacks the imprint, that is, the initial miniature. There is no mandatory concluding colophon that should state where, when, by whom, and at whose behest this book was written. From leaf 108 to the end of the chronicle, excluding only leaf 118, the cinnabar letters, that is, the capital letters written in red ink, are not added. It is as if the work was interrupted in the midst of it and was never returned to. Although such negligence is completely atypical for the compilation of illustrated chronicles. Most often, such chronicles were commissioned by very wealthy and influential individuals who would not tolerate shoddy work. Why, then, was the production of the Radziwiłł Chronicle treated so carelessly? And why were they in such a hurry? Finding precise answers to these questions is quite difficult. Perhaps future researchers will be able to uncover all the secrets of the Radziwiłł Chronicle. But today, we can confidently say that in the 18th century, the discovery of the so-called ancient chronicles had tremendous significance. Although the writing of Russian history began during the reign of the early Romanovs, until the Radziwiłł Chronicle, the new historical version was merely a court theory without serious documentary evidence. But after its discovery, the Romanovs finally had a document, a primary source, which supposedly served as a scientific foundation for the theory. This foundation was reinforced exclusively by foreign historians. For the Romanovs, the appearance of the Radziwiłł Chronicle was really necessary. With its help, the Romanov falsifiers justified several forgeries. The first forgery is the calling of the princes to Russia from the northwestern lands. It is absolutely clear that this falsification was made in favor of the Romanov dynasty, which originated from the Pskov and Lithuanian lands. Now, no one dared to question the Romanovs' right to the Russian throne. The second forgery involved altering the location of Novgorod the Great. It was moved from the Volga to the Pskov region. The name Novgorod was taken away from the ancient Russian capital of Yaroslavl and given to another city. Along with the previous name, a significant part of the history of Yaroslavl and the Russian history of the Rurik era disappeared from the pages of history. And the third forgery is, certainly, the chronology of Kievan Rus, which, thanks to the Radziwiłł Chronicle, was tied to the new Scaligerian chronology. For decades, the Norman theory of the origin of Russia was considered absolutely accurate and infallible. Despite the fact that the authors of this theory were German historians, for a long time, the most fervent supporters of this theory were not European historians but Russian ones. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Western European historiographers, for sure, acknowledged that ancient Russia was founded by Scandinavians, but they did not specifically delve into this issue. However, Russian Normanists vigorously argued for their people's slave origin. For 1.5 centuries, Romanov historians stood guard over the Norman theory. Following Müller and Schlotzer were Karamzin, Solovyov, and Kluchevsky. The confrontation between the Normanists and anti-Normanists lasted for over 200 years. Until 1917, the Norman theory and the version of Russian history based on it were the official historical version of the ruling dynasty. But after the fall of the Romanov dynasty, the need for this theory disappeared. In the 1920s, attitudes towards the Norman theory began to change in Russian historical science, and gradually it transformed from a scientific theory into an unscientific one. It seems that Russian historians were finally able to impartially examine the Radziwiłł Chronicle and see that, indeed, a page with the Norman theory was glued in. It is not surprising that this fact was carefully concealed during the Romanov era. Only a narrow circle of people had access to the Chronicle. If the Slavophiles of the 19th century had learned that the foundation of the infamous Norman theory, against which they fiercely fought, was just a dubious glued-in page, it would have caused such an uproar in not only scholarly circles but throughout Russian society, with uncertain consequences.
The historical concepts that have entered modern textbooks were formed in a certain era, based on the knowledge available at that time. Now, new sources have emerged, and there are all the prerequisites for conducting new work, making new discoveries, and, as in any field of science, moving forward.
Today, the Radziwiłł Chronicle is published as part of the complete collection of Russian chronicles and as a separate colorful edition. So now anyone interested can see on what the Norman theory was based. There is a common belief that over time, many significant historical events gradually fade from collective memory. Therefore, after centuries, it is practically impossible to reconstruct authentic information about them. However, in world history, there are many examples of the memory of events from long-gone days living on after several centuries. And if information about certain historical facts has not been preserved, the reason lies not in the forgetfulness of new generations but in something else entirely. Unfortunately, throughout the history of humanity, individuals have emerged in various eras who distorted history, not only of their own people but also the history of humanity as a whole, substituting genuine facts with blatant fiction, all to serve their caste and personal interests. The most vivid example of this is the events that took place in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. You can learn more about it in our next film, Reformation, the dissolution of the empire.